The morning she buried her husband, nobody came to help her dig. Not because they were busy, not because they hadn't heard. They'd heard, every single one of them. The whole town of Elkridge had heard, and they stood at a careful distance, watching from behind curtain edges and church windows, while a woman with a scarred face pressed a shovel into frozen earth and did it herself. That was the day Clara Brennan understood something about the world that most people spend their whole lives trying not to learn. That the moment you stop being useful or pretty or convenient, you become invisible. And the moment you become inconvenient, you become something worse than that. She was 31 years old. She had $17, a horse, a canvas tent, and a land claim 3 miles north of nowhere. And she was going to build something on it, or she was going to die trying. What she was not going to do was wait for someone to rescue her. What she didn't know yet was that rescue wasn't coming, but something better was. Clara Brennan arrived at her land claim on the first cold morning of October, when the grass was already pale and the wind had teeth. The claim was nothing but rocky soil, pine trees at the edges, and a view of mountains that would have been beautiful if she had time for beauty. She didn't. Winter in that part of Montana didn't wait for anyone to feel ready, and she had exactly 6 weeks, maybe 8 if the season held, to get a roof over her head before the first real snow. She started the same morning she arrived. She marked the corners of the cabin with stakes she'd cut herself. She paced out the dimensions. She'd studied the plans she'd borrowed from the Elkridge Library, memorized them during the 3 nights she'd spent in a boarding house before the whispers started and the landlady asked her quietly, apologetically, if she might find somewhere else. The scar made people uncomfortable, the landlady said. Bad for business. Clara had nodded, packed her trunk, and left without making a scene. She had practice at that. The scar ran from her left temple down to her jawline. Old now, pale and smooth against her weathered skin. Most people saw it before they saw anything else about her, before they saw her dark, steady eyes, or the capable way she moved, or the intelligence that lived in her expression. They saw the scar, and they made a story out of it, and the story was never kind. She worked from first light to last light every day. She felled logs herself, stripped them herself, notched them herself. She developed blisters that became calluses. Her back ached every morning, and she got up anyway. By the end of the second week, she had 2 walls rising and a reputation in Elkridge as either very brave or very foolish, depending on who you asked. And Amos Pritchard, who owned the general store and half the town's pinion, had started sending messages. The first message said he admired her grit. The second said he had honest work available at his boarding house, good pay, safe situation. The third said he was willing to discuss a more permanent arrangement. Clara burned all 3 in her fire pit and went back to work. She was hauling a full-length log up a slope on a late October afternoon, rope over her shoulder, boots digging into rocky soil, her faded calico dress mud-stained to the knees, when she heard hoofbeats on the ridge above her. She straightened slowly. She didn't run and she didn't call out. She just stood there, breathing hard, and watched the rider come down. He was somewhere past 40, this man, with the kind of face that had spent years in weather, gray threading through dark hair, a coat that was good once and was still serviceable. He rode like a man who'd been on horses his whole life, easy and unhurried, and he looked at her half-built cabin and her canvas tent and her meager fire, and then he looked at her, and she waited for the pity or the calculation or the judgment. He dismounted and said, "That's a lot of cabin for one person." She told him she didn't need charity from strangers. Her voice came out steady even though her hands were still tight on the rope. Old habit. Keep the voice steady. Don't give anything away. He studied the walls for a moment, tilting his head at the corner joints. Then he said the roof wouldn't hold without proper bracing, and a storm was coming in 2 weeks, maybe less. She said she'd manage. He looked at her then, really looked. Not at the scar specifically, but he didn't look away from it either. He just looked at her like she was a whole person standing there, which was unusual enough that it made her shoulders pull tight with something she didn't quite have a name for. He said, "I'm not pretty," and she realized he was reading her expression, reading the waiting in her face, the preemptive defense. She whispered it herself then, because it was easier to say it first. "I'm not pretty.
Said it the way you say something you've had to say too many times, flat and ready for whatever came next. What came next was not what she expected. He met her eyes and said, "That's fine. I need honest, not fancy. Winter kills pretty folk first out here." She blinked. Something in her face shifted. She wasn't sure what to do with kindness that didn't want anything back, so she watched him with suspicion and something that might have been hope trying hard to stay small. His name was Jacob Morgan. He ran cattle 3 miles south. He picked up her hammer, tested the weight of it, noticed how the handle was wrapped in cloth strips fit to a smaller grip, and asked if she had nails. She pointed to the crate. He asked what she could offer in trade, because he was not a charity case either, and he understood she wasn't one. She said she could cook and mend. He said that was fair. They shook hands. Her grip matched his. He noticed she didn't look away. He told her they'd start at first light and rode off into the pines, and Clara sat down on a stump with her hands shaking. First snow in 2 weeks, first hope in 6 months. She wasn't sure which scared her more. Jacob came back at dawn as promised. He was not a man who made promises lightly, and he was not a man who broke the ones he made. They worked through that first day with the economy of 2 people who respected each other's competence. No wasted words, no wasted movement. He examined her lumber stacks and her sorted nails and her careful measurements and said she did good work. She handed him coffee and said she'd taught herself. He drank it without complaint, strong and bitter as it was, and asked why she'd come out here alone when the town had widows enough. She told him about Pritchard, about the rumors that followed her refusal, about the story the town had built around her fire and her scar. She told him about Thomas, about what kind of man he'd been after grief turned him mean, about the night the lamp broke and the fire started, and the choice she'd made to try to pull him out even then, even after everything, and how she'd gotten free and he hadn't, and how the town buried him a hero because he was a deacon's nephew and it was easier than the truth. Jacob listened without interrupting. When he finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he told her about Sarah. Beautiful woman, he said. Everyone loved her. She wanted town life, dances, admiration, a husband who was something impressive to stand next to. The ranch bored her. He'd known she was unhappy and kept hoping the land would be enough, and it wasn't, and she died in childbed 2 years back, the baby with her. Clara said she was sorry. He said not to me. He'd loved Sarah, but he hadn't liked her much towards the end, and she hadn't liked him either, and the truth was that when she died, his first thought was that he was free. He said he'd been hating himself for that ever since. Clara quietly said, maybe God gave people what they couldn't keep so they'd learn what they actually needed. Jacob picked up his hammer and said, maybe, or maybe God was just quieter than preachers claimed. They shook hands again that evening on the terms of their arrangement, practical, clean, nobody needed to make it more complicated. And Clara watched him ride away and turned back to her half-built cabin with something unfamiliar stirring in her chest that she told herself firmly was just the cold air.
They worked through November as the cold deepened. The cabin walls rose solid and true. A rhythm developed between them without discussion, the way rhythms do between people who pay attention to each other. He'd lift, she'd brace. She'd measure, he'd cut. She anticipated what he needed, and he read her exhaustion before she said a word and said they were stopping for the day and didn't frame it as a question. Evenings by her fire, she read to him from her water-stained books. Homer first, then Shakespeare. He listened the way a man listens to water after a long, dry season. A messenger from town brought supplies one afternoon with a note from Pritchard pinned to the flour sack. The offer still stood, the note said. Honest work for an honest woman. Leave the arrangement. Jacob's face darkened, and he started to say he was riding to town, and Clara caught his arm and said to let them talk. These walls didn't care about gossip. That evening, when she voiced Penelope's suitors in pompous tones, Jacob laughed. It was a deep, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and it filled the cabin like something the room hadn't known before. He stopped, startled by the sound of his own joy. Clara stopped reading. She said she hadn't heard laughter in this place, not since she arrived. He said neither had he, not in 2 years. They looked at each other across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. And then she smiled, small and real, and kept reading. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line. The blizzard hit mid-December with 3 days of fury. They were trapped inside together, wind howling so loud they had to raise their voices, the tarp over the unfinished section of roof fighting every gust. But the walls held. Every joint, every beam, every nail they'd driven together, it all held. And that mattered in a way that went beyond timber. They fell into the forced intimacy of the storm. She read for hours. He listened and mended tack, and slowly, haltingly, began to follow the words on the page himself, learning to read by her voice. He taught her to braid rope properly, and their hands brushed, and she didn't pull back. The second night, she woke screaming. Jacob crossed the room instantly and stopped at a respectful distance, hands open where she could see them, and said her name until her eyes focused. He said she was safe. He said the fire was banked and Thomas was gone and she was here, in her cabin, in her walls. She sat in the dark shaking and said she hated that she was still afraid to be touched, still afraid to trust anyone close. He sat on the floor beside her bedroll, careful and still, and told her that when Sarah died, his first thought was relief, and that he'd been so ashamed of that he hadn't let anyone near him since, scared of what needing someone again might mean, scared he'd fail again. They sat in that truth together, two damaged people discovering they weren't alone in the dark. The third night, exhausted, Clara fell asleep against his shoulder while he read haltingly from the book, learning. He didn't move until dawn. She woke, realized where she was, and started to apologize. He said not to. She murmured, half in sleep still, that he smelled like pine smoke and safety. He whispered back that she felt like home. He nearly meant it as an observation. It came out as a confession. Morning broke clear and bright. They separated with an awkward silence that held everything and named nothing. And then Jacob stepped outside to check the chimney and froze. Fresh horse tracks circled the cabin in the snow. Someone had stood close enough in the blizzard to see through the windows. Their privacy had always been an illusion. The week before Christmas, Clara announced she was going to town for supplies. Jacob said the town wasn't kind to her. She said they could be unkind to her face then because she was tired of hiding. He rode beside her in silence, and when they reached Elkridge on a Sunday morning, just as the congregation spilled from the church, she walked down Main Street with her chin up and her scar in full winter light, and she didn't look at the ground once. Preacher Whitmore blocked the mercantile steps. Pritchard stood beside him, smiling his careful smile. The crowd gathered. The trap closed. Preacher's voice carried across the cold street, calling her a woman of sin, calling their arrangement a defilement. Jacob felt the familiar pressure of reputation bearing down. All the years of careful appearance, all the years of being Sarah's respectable husband. The instinct rose before he could stop it, and he heard himself say it, the words falling out small and damaging into the cold air. It's just work. The cabin's nearly done. Clara went rigid beside him. She turned and walked to the wagon without a word. Pritchard's smile widened. Jacob stood in the wreckage of what he'd said and understood exactly what he'd done, and it was worse than anything the town could have accused him of, because he'd done it to someone who trusted him. The silent ride home lasted forever. At the cabin, she climbed down, spoke without looking at him. "Don't come back. The contract is done." She closed the door in his face, the door he had hung. And Jacob sat in the wagon in the beginning of new snow and faced what he was. Christmas week. Jacob's ranch house, warm and empty. The whiskey bottle on the table, untouched. Sarah's grave visible through the frost-glazed window on the hill. He sat there for 3 days, and on the third day, old Samuel Reed rode up and didn't dismount, and looked down at him and said that woman had built more with broken hands than most men managed with whole ones, and did he intend to let fear win twice?
Jacob asked what if she wouldn't forgive him. Samuel said then he'd earned it, but he still had to try or die alone in the cold bed he was making for himself. Samuel rode away. Jacob looked at the grave on the hill for a long time. Then he said quietly that he was sorry. Sorry he couldn't be what Sarah needed. Sorry he couldn't love her the way she wanted. But he was done apologizing for wanting something real. He saddled his horse. Sunday morning, Jacob Morgan stood up in front of the full congregation with his hat in his hands and told them everything. He told them about his cowardice. He told them who Clara Brennan actually was, what she had survived and built and endured. He told them she was worth 10 of their so-called decent people. He said if they wanted to judge someone, they should judge him. Then he rode 3 miles north. Clara was on the roof, hammering the last shingles when she heard the horse. She didn't stop working. She didn't look down. He dismounted, picked up the spare hammer, and climbed the ladder without asking permission. They worked side by side for an hour in silence. The last section of roof came together under their joint effort, every nail driven, every shingle laid. Sitting on the ridgeline together with their breath fogging in the cold air, Jacob finally spoke. He told her what he'd done in the church. He told her they'd just been work, and that those were the worst 2 words he'd ever said. He told her she was the realest thing he'd known in years. He said he wasn't good with words, as she'd seen last Sunday, but he was good with his hands, and he was trying to be good with his heart. He asked if he would let him build a life with her. Not pretty, not fancy, just honest. She studied him for a long moment. Gray in his hair, lines in his face, eyes that finally genuinely saw her. Then she said she didn't need rescuing and never had. He said he knew that, but he wouldn't mind a partner. Equal share, equal say. He extended his hand. She took it, and when he pulled her closer gently, asking with his eyes first, and she nodded, their first kiss was gentle and terrified and exactly right. On the horizon, dust rose. Wagons. Jacob said that after his sermon, some people had felt ashamed. They were bringing lumber and tools and food. They wanted to help build the barn. Clara corrected him quietly. Their barn. The community that had judged them came and worked in the cold, and Clara stood beside Jacob watching and felt something she had believed was gone from her permanently. She belonged somewhere again.
Late March came with the first true warmth. The cabin was finished and inhabited, and Jacob courted Clara properly, riding out most evenings and sleeping in the chair by the fire when the hour grew too late. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to be patient with someone who had reasons to be careful. She was learning slowly what it felt like not to brace against kindness. They planted the garden together in the first soft spring days, and when Pritchard came to the gate one afternoon, hat in hand, with an apology shaped carefully in his mouth, Clara listened and then told him simply that he hadn't misjudged her. He just couldn't see past surfaces. Simple as that. No hard feelings, no business either. Good day. He left, and he had no power anymore, and that was the end of it. One evening, in soft golden light, sitting on the bench Jacob had built for the porch, watching the mountains go purple in the fading sky, he asked her quietly to marry him. He said it could be tomorrow or it could be years, and he wasn't going anywhere. Clara looked at the first stars beginning to appear and took his hand and told him to ask her when the wildflowers bloomed full. She wanted to say yes when the world was alive again. In the meadow below the porch, small early wildflowers were already pushing up through the last of the winter brown, determined and unhurried, reaching toward what was coming. Jacob looked at her once more in the last of the light and said she was beautiful. She touched her scar and said she was scarred. He said it was the same thing. The way he saw it, a scar just showed you'd been in a fight and gotten through it. The fire glowed warm through the cabin windows behind them. The barn stood solid beyond the garden. The mountains kept their ancient watch. And the cowboy and the scarred woman sat together on their porch in the gathering dark, two people who had stopped performing and started living, building tomorrow the only honest way, one quiet moment at a time. Pretty fades, fancy breaks, but honest builds a life that holds. And in the holding, broken things don't just mend, they become something stronger than they ever were before.